Well, it's a pleasure to be here and kicking off this very interesting and I think quite timely seminar, an interesting format. And I think it's hopefully it'll be productive for everyone who's a student here, and then for folks that are just attending. And I will say preparing for this was sort of interesting. I wasn't quite sure how best to prepare for it. I actually had just finished an invited paper for a special issue of Distance Education. And the editor for that is Jingjing Zhang at Beijing Normal University, and I've had a research collaboration with her for a couple of years now. And she's been quite interested in the complex systems work that I've been involved with, and that Peter is a co-author on a 2016 paper, an educational psychologist, and felt that there were some ways in which some of those ideas could apply to distance education. And then I'm thinking about the future of learning, and Peter and I actually have a book, 2010, so it's hardly new, but it was Designing Learning Environments of the Future. So thinking about the future has been kind of a fun thing to do for me, and then for us when we were working on that book. But I got to thinking, what does that really mean? And the future is always, after a certain kind of history. And so I thought I would just kind of prowl around on Google Scholar, and I found I was using history of future learning, education stuff, and I came across this. It's basically a blog. Audrey Waters, if that's how she says her name. If you get the file, there's a link to what she had. But I found some of the pictures that she had about kind of the historical views of what the future of learning would be like. And so this one, 1910, a year after my father was born, French artist wrote in the year 2000. So that's already 19 years old. And I love this, putting a bunch of books into a machine that the student assistant, the teaching assistant, I guess, the TA, is grinding them into some kind of electronic pulp. And then you're zapping it into the brains of the kids. Don't they look excited, huh? What do you think? I think I'm actually glad I missed that part of the future of learning, but it's creative. It's creative. Now, we go a few years later. There was an article, this image in I think kind of a popular journal on shortwave radio, I think is probably what that would be, Shortwave Craft. And now here this was just after television had kind of gotten invented. So that's the advanced technology. And so then you have the professor talking into the microphone, and then it's being transmitted, and then you got different people that are getting it. And you got a television in 1935, and the students are receiving their studies and listening intently. Kind of interesting, okay? Kind of progressive. This one, I love this. This is California Institute of Technology. It and MIT kind of duke it out for who's doing the greatest stuff in any given year, scientifically. And so one of the profs there in 1958, I was all of 5 years old then, so you can calculate my age. Push button education. Okay, so up there, if you're watching the video of the person, some formulas and so on, and then students would do things on their little machine, and it's going to keep track of stuff. And if you're having trouble, then you would get, you could talk to a real teacher or get feedback on stuff. So this is kind of an interesting vision. But I found this picture perhaps the most interesting. It's black and white, so it has a different. But Popular Science, again, it's a popular magazine back in the day. I think it's long been out of print. I used to read it when I was a kid. In 61, the ripe old age of 8 then. There was a prediction that by 1965, the 50% of US students would be using teaching machines, basically based on Skinner's notion of behavioral psychology and using these teaching machines that would be optimally preparing. But there's really something kind of dark and lonely, and I'm glad I'm not in that classroom. You know, it doesn't really look, it looked like the kids were having more fun with the things, you know, electrifying their brains with book pulp. But if that's some ideas from the popular press as well as from people in the academy about what the future of education would be, well, now we're 2019. How do these historical views stand up with what we're doing now and how we might then be thinking about things we would be doing and designing for in the future? And I would suggest that some people would say, well, yes, we've made progress. You know, we've got online education, we've got MOOCs, massive open online courses, we got open, flexible, and distance learning, the phrase that's the special issue in distance education that I did the invited paper for. You got notions of educational delivery at scale because we can now use the technology. We're getting lots of people that want to go to university or continue their education, but it's hard to get access. So now we can be using internet and various kinds of technologies to be delivering at scale. So have we made progress? Well, let's just reflect a bit about what did history get wrong and what did they get right about the future as it is now? Wrong? Well, the technologies are a bit different. You know, we don't grind up books and electronically pipe that content directly into the brains of students. I'm sure glad they didn't do that to me, and I bet I speak for many students around the world on that one. And of course, we aren't just limited to technologies that are radio or TV. Obviously, with the internet, we have a huge range of technologies, different kinds of systems, from handheld devices, virtual reality, and so on. So we've got lots of different kinds of systems, different ways to be transmitting, from satellites and undersea cables that are bringing high-speed internet around the world, and so on. And I guess I would say that they completely misjudged the kind of time to scaling. You know, in '61, to say that half of the U.S. student population was going to be using teaching machines in 4 years clearly didn't get it right. But as you all are maybe thinking about what you might be designing for reimagining the future learning, think about the issue of timelines, because stuff that I was doing for my PhD over 25 years ago that I thought would be commonly used, with my work and other work, hasn't. And so this time to scaling is an interesting issue to consider. But I will say, I think that they were spot on if we compare what they were basically proposing and what is currently being advocated by a significant number of people and well-resourced people. There is an emphasis on transmitting content. It's in a book, and we're going to get it into the heads of the kids. It's in the heads of a professor, we're going to beam it out there. We have a one-to-many. We got a whole bunch more people than we do, instructors and professors and so on. So we got to deal with that as an issue. So we're going to use the technologies that they were thinking about, the ones that we're doing now. But I would say what is really at the heart of what was proposed then, and which is absolutely fundamental, implicitly, to the way that systems that are being rolled out in the area of massive open online courses, open learning environments, and similar kinds of online tutorial systems, they are implicitly or explicitly didactic, transmissionist, direct instruction approaches. They absolutely nailed that historically. And that, I'm not saying that's what we recommend in the learning sciences, we'll talk about that in a minute, but what's being rolled out they were absolutely spot on. And so an issue then is, how do we make sure that what you folks might be thinking, or maybe stuff that Peter and I are thinking about, how we would like to see the future unfold a bit, in our own professional work, how do we get past this? Direct instruction as the way that these systems get rolled out. So we'll kind of engage that. One thought that I have is, let's think about what students are really learning. And how is it that we know if they're learning stuff? You know, what's being done in terms of these open, flexible, and distance learning kinds of systems? Well, I'll kind of scope what I'm talking about to those kinds of systems, because that's really what's getting the big money. That's really what's getting talked about a lot. Now, these systems make extensive use of what is called learning analytics. George Siemens is one of the people that's made a bit of a name for himself in this area. In his comments, he was asked to write a reflection piece on the special issue, as I was. And in his piece, the special issue has just come out online. I don't know, are you able to send around the latest version, the actual online? I got the published version yesterday, but anyway, he claims that learning analytics can play a central role in assessing, supporting, and extending innovations. Remember, we're talking about learning innovations in your class. Extending innovations such as open educational resources, Khan Academy, massive open online courses, as well as digital badges and micro-credentialing. Now, there's also an interesting paper that when I was putting together my talk, I kind of went through sort of quickly that George is actually a co-author on. Let's not forget, learning analytics are about learning. And it's actually a pretty good paper. And they do raise some interesting issues. And I kind of think that some of the issues that they were talking about in a general way, I'm going to be maybe jumping on a little bit more vigorously in the next couple of minutes. But basically, learning analytics are algorithms, okay? They allow you to identify patterns that you have in data. Essentially, when students are using these online kinds of systems, MOOCs and so on, there's log files that are generated by these online systems, and you could call them digital traces, if you will. It's kind of a nice phrase, I think. And that data can be mined using these algorithms. So this is the phrase data mining. Okay, that's what learning analytics are. You're looking at the data that's there, you're mining it to see if you can find patterns. And then there's the assumption, there's the assertion that patterns of learning behavior may provide insights into educational practices. And I'm sure that that's probably true. But in this paper, Gosovic, I don't know if I say his name properly, but he doesn't seem to claim that there's insights into learning that are necessarily being provided by the learning analytics, although some people in this literature seem to be making claims about the learning that's going on. Now, what I propose in this reflection paper is that I think that some of the problem that we have relates to how we operationally define learning. It's a word that just gets thrown around like innovation gets thrown around. Everybody's innovating this and that. It gets used in a very general way. We've got learning analytics. We got machine learning. We got deep learning. We got open, flexible, and distance learning. We got all kinds of learning. But what's human learning? Now, in the paper, Educational Psychologist paper of 2016, which maybe to brag a little bit, we won the Outstanding Paper Award for that journal in 2016. But with Peter and then our co-author Manu Kapoor, we proposed a definition of human learning as not as something that is, such as receiving instruction or acquiring knowledge, but rather as something that emerges. We defined individual learning as changes in human cognitive processes involved with the encoding and the capacity to manipulate and engage symbolic representations, formalisms, and sociocultural practices that emerge from the interaction with a variety of complex systems. An individual may experience that lead to enhanced performance in intellectual, physical, and affective realms of life. Now, this is a complex systems as well as a socio-cognitive definition. There are some folks in the learning sciences that are queasy about cognition. I don't think Peter and I are queasy about cognitive things, but we're not sociocultural super advocates either. And indeed, the 2016 paper, we provide a critique of cognitively only types of theorizing, or situated or sociocultural only types of theorizing, and we propose that views coming out of the study of complex systems provide us ways to think about how to kind of interconnect these kind of different levels of theorizing that have driven much of the research that we have in the learning sciences, and also related to understanding systems of learning. Now, I'll kind of leave the paper in for you to kind of dig in a little bit. But in this, I give some examples of kind of derived from open, flexible distance learning, complex systems ideas such as agents, self-organization. System level is very important. What's going on cognitively? Students interacting with other students. What's going on, and they might be interacting digitally. What might be emerging in terms of information that is pulled together from the system, say average post-test performance in a MOOC, and then the notion of emergence, how new patterns, properties emerge at a different level of a system from interactions at a micro or meso level of the system. So that you can get a little bit more detail about that. One of the issues that I raise in the reflection paper, though, if you're looking at issues of learning, our key agent really are the students. So what is it that students are learning? And if you're saying, well, we're looking at the digital traces that we get with these learning analytics kinds of things, what kind of traces are you getting about what students are learning about? You got clicks of web pages and their duration. I might get some ways in which there's online interactions between students or instructors. And of course, you can be getting assessments of online testing. But the issue about the suitability of the kinds of assessments that you can be getting, doing with these kinds of systems is a real issue. Don't really have time to go into this, but I argue in the paper that we have kind of three main kinds of knowledge that we can assess. We could be assessing declarative knowledge, factual kinds of information, your understanding of how and why things might be, which can be called explanatory knowledge, procedural knowledge, and then also the ability to use that knowledge that you have, the declarative, the explanatory, to be working in new areas, solving new problems. You have different kinds of assessments for each of those kinds of knowledge and those kinds of tasks. And a challenge that you really have with these open, flexible, and distance learning systems is that they primarily use assessments that are well suited for assessing declarative knowledge. Multiple choice questions work just fine for that. They don't work fine for assessing higher levels of understanding, the conceptual and procedural kinds of knowledge. They simply do not do that. And if you're interested in the assessment thing, have a look at the National Research Council 2001 volume, Knowing What Students Know. It's still kind of the gold standard for really explaining issues related to assessment. Oh yeah, things kind of bounce around here. What I suggest in the reflection article is that there's an under-recognized problem with distance education and MOOCs and that type of thing, and that is that students might be doing quite well on learning declarative kinds of knowledge. And your multiple choice items can be assessing that, and you might be seeing some gains pre to post on those. Great, that's fine. Experts know a lot of declarative knowledge. It's not that it's bad. But if those kinds of assessments are not valid and reliable ways to assess deeper level conceptual understandings related to explanatory procedural knowledge, well, then you could be failing to detect that the kinds of approaches that you're providing students may be inadequate for developing higher levels of learning outcomes that you would be expecting, particularly since many of these systems are specifically being rolled out, pushed on higher education. So I think I'm probably getting low on time. What I would suggest that these are research issues in that field. But you need to have the assessments to find out if you have the problems. And if you do not have valid assessments of these digital traces, then it's an emperor's new clothes kind of thing. You just simply don't know if there's a problem or not. So maybe there's not a problem. Maybe I'm wrong. My hunch, that there's a problem out there and that students cannot get the kinds of really deep level understanding from these kinds of systems unless they are designed differently and different kinds of assessments are being used. My take on the future of learning, I think we're going to find a time when insight is the sudden cessation of stupidity. I think we're going to find that some of the things we've been doing in education have actually been stupid. And we're going to realize that we could do things a bit differently and we can get some dramatically enhanced learning outcomes. So the future doesn't necessarily have to be an intensely radical change. Because this is a complexity thing, sensitivity to initial conditions, you understand the leverage points, and you design the system in ways that you're going to get amplification that's going on in the system so that you could be having a large impact by having the right kinds of small initial changes. And so, anyway, I think in the learning sciences, learning and cognitive sciences, that we've got a range of different pedagogical approaches than transmissionist ones. The future is not going to be the technology, it's going to be implementing learning designs and teaching approaches that are fundamentally different than what we saw from the history of future education, and frankly, what are currently being rolled out at scale now with too much of what's being called distance education. Approaches like I've been doing research with my colleague Manu Kapoor, productive failure, cognitive research related to analogical comparison, approaches like project-based learning, design-based inquiry learning, project-based learning, collaborative learning, hybrid designs of these kinds of learning and cognitive sciences, learning designs and approaches, this I believe is what the future of learning really is going to be about. And combining that with the kind of amazing affordances that we now have with advanced technologies that are involving artificial intelligence, virtual, augmented kinds of reality, mixed reality, and so on. We've got some amazing ways in which we can create very different kinds of experiences for students to be learning in, but it has to be coupled with the right kinds of learning designs. And so, happy learning.
In that sense, I guess also sort of want to portray a bit of a picture of humbleness. I've been part of what I want to talk about a bit, and have been thinking about recently a bit more again, is artificial intelligence in education, and I want to say a couple of things on AI in the learning sciences, and I had the privilege, sometimes also felt the pain of being part of the history of AI in education. So basically my main career, and I was 0 when Michael was 5, and I leave it to you to do the math, I've been involved with the first wave and of AI in education, now I guess we're experiencing the third one in my system, and I want to sort of share a bit what I learned in the first wave, try to forget in the second, and now try to make productive for the third. So we find ourselves again at a time when artificial intelligence in general, and also for education, is again seen as providing lots of promises for work, for health, for entertainment, and for education. And so things such as personalized learning as becoming really realizable now, quality education for everybody, the more or less automated school or university, one robot per student. I'm sure MIT or so have, that actually is a motto there. And in general, a promise of radical change that will make education much more effective, personal, and enjoyable than what we currently have. And of course, we promised the same thing some 30 years ago, and so I want to go back a bit in time. Before I do that, I guess a good starting point is to remind ourselves, or me to remind you, what any approach to computer-supported or technology-supported support for individualizing and personalizing learning will have to realize. Whatever their technology, it will need things and capacities such as being able to analyze students' performance, hopefully more than just what they do in assessments and quizzes, but actual and hopefully authentic performance. Analyzing performance, doing assessments and measurement is a key part. From that, whatever technology will have to build some sort of student model and an idea and machine-based hypothesis what these students know and do not know, and where they might go best in the next learning steps that will need to be done. So we need a student model as a diagnostic component and an instructional planning component, something that takes the diagnostic information and turns it into advice. Right? There's no point in doing diagnosis if we can't give advice and feed forward. That will need to be given back to the students in some form. Lots of issues around human-computer interfaces and how to interact with students, ideally through natural language, but that's a hard nut to crack. But at that front we're getting much better. And then the cycle starts again. And each of these elements is pretty hard to do computationally, and I would claim it's still pretty hard to do despite changes in technology and infrastructure. So because I think the best way to understand the future is to understand the past, or at least in the way that we need to understand the past to not repeat mistakes in the future. I'll give you a short and subjective three-generation view of AI in education. I think the first generation probably best described as being based on expert systems technology, and interestingly for the learning sciences as well, based on theories of human learning. The second generation got rid of human learning theory and was based on essentially semantic technologies, knowledge technologies, in particular the semantic web. And the third generation, that's what we're currently talking about when you hear AI in education in more recent publications, is data-intensive AI, machine learning. And the three coexist. Don't make a mistake to think they are, one. This is not the next generation removed and erased everything from before. They happily or not so happily coexist, and maybe in the coexistence there is more to be gained from than looking at them separately. Anyway, first generation, the vision was an individual tutor for each student, pretty much along the lines of some of the fascinating pictures that Michael showed. One of the outcomes of that wave, and they are one of the few first generation AI based approaches to teaching and learning that still exist, and it exists in the United States at scale. Some 3,000 to 5,000 schools on last count use some form of artificial intelligence tutor for one-to-one tutoring of, for instance, geometry and mathematics and based in Newtonian physics and some programming tutors. And what these tutoring systems provide is a dedicated interface where you can actually solve problems in. The computer tracks and analyzes each step that the student makes in the interface, for instance, by trying to prove something about triangles, and gives individualized and performance-dependent feedback to the student. if you Google cognitive tutors and maybe Carnegie Mellon or so, you can online access these machines now provided as web services, and learn geometry, algebra pretty effectively. In a similar vein, somewhat different approach, but again informed by cognitive theory of problem solving, memory and learning. Different class of tutors did not go into problem solving, but also addressed issues of social and communication skills and how to become a good salesperson or a good boss in having critical communications with an employee. And those were typically based on, or many of those were based on Roger Shank's initial script theory, later expanded into case-based reasoning, both as a theory of human learning as well as a way of computational problem solving. And we had these then virtual coaches, if you want, that communicated in in written English at least, with you at times. The technology behind this, as I said, is basically grounded in what was known at the time about expert models. Again, the expert models of the first generation were built on psychological studies of human expertise that in the 1980s went in very well together at Stanford and Pittsburgh and at MIT and at some other places in the States in particular, but not only there. And so the basic computational tools then used were rules and production rules and constraints. And somewhat later we went a bit more into probabilistic reasoning with Bayesian networks, knowledge-based theory, and the like. No time to go into details, enough to know, I want to go forward, not backward. So here's just an example for a typical rule-based approach to expertise. It's from the Myson system, which was one of the best systems to have a computer do medical diagnosis, but some parts of internal medicine on a level of a well-trained doctor. And as you can see, it basically encodes, the basic knowledge format encodes the kind of decision rules that a doctor would have when listening to a patient or interpreting lab results. And actually, these rules came from interviews with expert doctors, and were translated into a format then that a computer can also use, interpret, and apply. And if you add to that as a pedagogical expert, so a domain expert would be medical knowledge, for instance. You can, of course, use something like this for university level medicine training and education. If you add a pedagogical expertise, expert knowledge how to teach a domain, you get our expert tutors, right, which then interact with a student. As you might have guessed, this would be quite work intensive to do, because the domain knowledge as well as the pedagogical knowledge have to be written and getting out of experts in a very labor-intensive way. So we don't see many of these systems in use, basically because they are very time-intensive to engineer. Also, they were quite brittle. They were really good only at a small line of expertise. That was then seen as a hallmark of expertise anyway. So you cannot ask the algebra tutor any other recommendations for math learning other than, very specific algebra or geometry knowledge. The second generation was then came the internet, and along with the internet came the idea of in education to not only help students using internet resources to learn, but also help teachers and instruction designers, trainers to use electronic tools to help them authoring courses, online courses in particular. And so one important enabler to make the internet useful to help teachers like professors and school teachers create courses and create lessons would be to have to ask smart questions to the internet, and it would come back with the right kind of answers. That you can experience this any day today. If you go to the Google machine, you'll find that it's not so trivial. So if you have a good answer and you have an idea what the answer, a good question, and you have an idea what the answer will be, you realize that most of the answers you get from Google are not terribly, what you were looking for. So for instance, if I would ask Google, come back with learning activities that are realizable by some blogging, maybe I want to involve blogging in my pedagogy, right? Often done at university, for instance, also at schools. I'm pretty sure, many of the things Google would come back with would be useless in that sense. And so what had to happen is that we had to basically realize that one has to create a layer on top of the internet that links the information, it filters information and links it in systematic ways to allow the internet as a knowledge resource to actually provide smart answers to and useful answers to fairly openly formulated questions or queries. Now, making the internet useful and linking information together proved to be possible, but again, very, very labor intensive. So the original vision was only partially realized. The vision was really, we have a student or a teacher, and both would be using through their local machine, laptop, PC, Mac, whatever, would be using a network of other machines, and these machines, internet web servers or knowledge servers, would contain knowledge that then can be dynamically configured to provide almost real-time, if not good offline courses. To make that happen, as I said, the internet needed to be augmented by links, and it proved quite labor intensive to make the web smart or semantic. In particular, it needed and still needs humans linking content on the internet together, basically by hand, and that is supported by various knowledge technologies, in particular what's known as ontology tools in the semantic web world, which themselves are fairly hard to learn, but quite powerful. However, it needs a human. It needed a human to sort of find out what the relation between blogging and about the US and is this appropriate for level 3, class 3 students in Australia. It needed humans to do this kind of linking things together. Given that the content on the internet grows exponentially and still does, I believe, but human labor does not grow exponentially. Certainly, if you need to pay for it, that proved to be a bit hard to scale. We find ourselves now at the third generation of AI, and this is based, as I mentioned already, on the idea that we can use machines to do the linking, to find knowledge patterns in particular online content. And so we can basically mine data, but also mine text and images and videos on YouTube, and look for relevant knowledge, also relevant then for the business of teaching and learning. And that's, of course, an attractive thought, because it would make human labor in this knowledge generation step unnecessary. And the question is, of course, how to do it. Now, machine learning has been developed out of a number of technologies. As we see nowadays, it's very powerful, but it's really very powerful at one thing. And that thing is classification or pattern discovery, right? So if you can do it, Google does it, Microsoft does it, you can actually hook up to their machines and their servers and their services for free if you're not a company, and and use all these machine learning algorithms also now as a service. And to the extent that you have thousands of examples of something you want to find patterns in, and somebody who tagged those thousands of examples as being useful, for instance, being a dog, a cat, a human, or a shoe, or a key, whatever, machine learning algorithms can go through those examples and generate, for instance, decision trees. Decision trees are basically, you ask a question from the top. In the simplest case, it's a binomial decision. If it's true, you are done here. If it's false, you have to look further. This is a decision tree to identify plants or classify plants, given a couple of thousand of features of plants. It's a famous data set used for machine learning algorithms to sort of compare their effectiveness and quality. Decision trees are nice because we can actually understand them as humans. We often do decision trees ourselves, right? Do I want to go to Rome or to Barcelona on my next trip? Well, if it's fall, I might rather go to Rome because I see there's more rain in Barcelona or whatnot, etc. So you can use that logic. A lot of attention is given to neural nets, which are very powerful indeed to identify, to classify things and identify patterns. They do so in ways which are highly mathematical, but basically very well understood. And the same logic essentially applies. Here's a face recognition, sort of a mock-up of a face recognition neural net. So you have to give it lots of pictures that either say this is male, female, or Asian, Caucasian, African, whatnot, whatever you want to have classified at the output, or this is Jim and this is Sandra, and then you have to train your net to over here sort of indicate which of the possible targets is likely in the in a particular image. Neural nets are, realize deep, what's called deep machine learning, but it's not deep in any human sense. It just means that we have several layers. One layer looks for instance, very basic objects such as round things and rectangular corners, and then, the next layer looks for combinations of these more basic elements and find something like noses and ears and can identify noses and ears and eyes. And on the next layer, this sort of becomes like an image of a person. And so the logic, that's the logic of neural nets. These are terribly powerful, really, but they are very good for face recognition, for instance, right? So, and used now often in airports, etc., for face recognition, not only in science fiction movies anymore. They really can identify persons with high reliability. Of course, for educational purposes, we might wonder, is this classification power, what does this actually give us for educational purposes? I think there are interesting approaches when it comes to, for instance, evaluate or help to score. If you get, from 200 students multimedia slides, PowerPoint slides or so, I think that's a really interesting area to use neural nets. So I think they are good for the scoring aspect, in particular of pictorial information, of movies, sound, image, photography, even language to some extent. Depends on what you want to give students as feedback. But other than that, they obviously also have some clear, at least currently, some obvious shortcomings, right? They learn association and patterns. They cannot. What's coming out of them that cannot be explained to the human user. Decision tree can be explained. What's coming out of a neural net, how it came to a decision. This is Carl and it's not, Karen. That's almost impossible to explain. Interestingly, these days, machine learners retranslate neural net findings into decision tree to make them understandable, the decision by humans. That's this area of explainable AI becomes a big thing. I guess one of the problems that also I find with machine learning as useful for education is that often these machine learning algorithms and what they yield in terms of power are pitched as beating humans, not as helping them. So I don't quite know where that leaves us. One thing is sure, the system that plays Go like better than any human is really not a good tool to teach you Go. There you go. Obviously, these machine algorithms, at least the ones that we, that run under the label of machine learning, have no sense of a curriculum or of knowledge, of a sequence of knowledge. They have no notion of sequence, which is a fairly fundamental limitation. If you think about teaching and learning, human learning is path dependent to a large extent. They have no sense of pedagogy or teaching, right? Other than, saying, you are now performing similar to this person or to this event, and therefore, I can tell you as a computer, if you continue like this, you might end up at a place where you don't want to end up in your problem solving or so. But that's all based on, that's about it when it comes to what we might call pedagogy or teaching knowledge, which obviously is not really sufficient for many purposes. And maybe, one of the problems, I don't know whether it's a problem, it doesn't have to be a problem per se, I think it is one, is that they're only partially grounded in research on human learning. There is a wider story why machine learning, such as realized by neural nets, is sort of a plausible candidate for what the human brain does, at least the biological brain does, when it looks at the world. But there's a long story from there to learning in schools. So these are the three things, and I want to wrap up by saying where does this leave us? 2 minutes on future, and then I end. I think what we will see clearly is, an integration with new display technologies. Obviously, there will be lots of power in combining AI in education with things such as augmented and virtual reality to overcome also the limitations of just language-based interfaces. We'll see unpredictable, I think, at least as far as I'm not in a position to predict what will happen in the intersection of the Internet of Things with AI. Internet of Things meaning essentially that everything is equipped with a sensor, really everything is connected to the Internet via the sensor. So while I'm dancing around here, the Internet would know. If I'm touching, it would know the position of your bum on your seat, which actually is an interesting indicator for attention, just in case you wonder. It would know your pen, right, and where it is, and if you start doodling something, it would know that because your pen has a web server and a sensor built in. And this happens already. If you drive over Sydney's new streets, they all have sensors in the asphalt. They go directly to the cloud. And hopefully will happen in the future. No bridges will stop. So, of course, this basically comes together, AI and Internet of Things and automation, in the story of automation of work. And you may or not be familiar with the predictions here. 60% of current occupations, of those 60% of jobs, 30% of the activities, and in each of these jobs, on average, can be automated within the next 5 years, given today's technology, right? So that's a fairly conservative prediction because it's built just on today's technology. 5 years is eternally when it comes to technology development. We might see, fairly radical changes to at least workplace learning and that I'm not sure what will happen in schools and universities, but clearly there's a huge potential. So then we get into quite fundamental questions, assuming that we would really get out of the synergy of these developments, we would get new AI-enabled or cognitive tools that are affordable in schools and in universities for individuals to purchase or to use. We get into some very interesting questions, such as equity. So if I have more money to pay a more advanced tool, when we sit the same test, so who's going to be assessed here? Is it it will be the human tool hybrid, the system, and that's an obvious question, but also the nature of what's worth knowing again might be quite, and teaching hence will come under, again under scrutiny, like when we had any technology revolution in the last 30 years. My last slide is on the learning sciences. What can the learning sciences contribute, or what are challenges and opportunities for the learning sciences in this in the current and somewhat future environment? So I think the learning sciences can and will need to contribute as far as AI in education is concerned to address the issue of explainability and human-in-the-loop AI, right? So we know from first and second generation AI that at least first generation AI spend a lot of attention to how to communicate, how a computer can communicate with a student as to engage in a productive dialogue, be that language-based or other forms of interaction. And it's not a trivial thing to do. And the machine learning stuff that you read, neural nets or so, have nothing to say on that. They have nothing to say in human-computer interaction interfaces that would need to be translated. We have a rich knowledge base on the learning sciences, on learning from tutoring, learning from dialogue that can be brought to bear here and to fruition. I think there is definitely value in perhaps articulating sharper and in new ways what the relation is between human learning and cognition and machine learning. And there are interesting connection points, but they are currently very much basic research, and hardly any tech developer or machine learning applier of machine learning techniques knows about the debate in cognitive science around, is the human brain essentially, or the biological brain, not only the human, is it a Bayesian engine, right? Can we, so it's the Bayesian brain theory or proposal. There is strong research in animal cognition as well as in human cognition that the brain to a large extent functions like a pattern completion engine. And neural nets are actually quite interesting and often used in that respect also as a candidate for understanding and emulating that kind of capacity. So there definitely are connection points, but I think we need to sort of revive this idea that AI in education may also have to be grounded not only in technology, but also in, however effective, but also an understanding of human learning. And I think that what Michael and we would both sort of circumscribe to, and if only because we got research funded that we could address. And maybe there's a more radical agenda needed, and I'm trying to explore this a bit in my own work together with Lena and with colleagues in Australia and hopefully around the world, where we think of AI as not only being informed by and related to studies of human learning and brain science, but also sort of to this social, economic, political, organizational surround that in which learning takes place. So this notion of socially embedded AI that sort of questions not only what can AI do, but also who builds it, who controls it, who decides how to use it and not to do, who are the experts, to what extent is expertise limited to a particular few, to what extent can expertise be distributed or had across larger sections of the population, in particular teachers and the teaching profession. What does it mean for the teaching profession in the near future and its capacity to use that kind of machine power productively, etc., etc. So there are interesting things for maybe somewhat revised and more radical version of AI in education than just seeing it as a learning engine. Thank you very much.
All right, is anyone chomping at the bit to ask a question? Does anyone want to be the first to start?
A question for you. With regards to the 8 conceptual perspectives of your CSC FL, what other attributes would you add to the existing framework when looking at other types of learning environments?
What would I add to the framework?
Yeah, to broaden it.
I don't have any need to broaden it. I think that the principles that we have in the complex systems conceptual framework of learning are sufficient to inform theorizing that could be done, for example, how you might be designing a particular learning technology. You'd want to be looking at the particular levels that are involved. The kind of general recommendation with complexity folks is you kind of look at 3 levels. You have sort of the level you're interested at, and then maybe you think one up and one down. So if you're in a classroom and you want kids to be, learning collaboratively and stuff, that's maybe one level that you'd have interest at. But you'd also want to be thinking, say, a level up, which might be aspects about, say, the classroom learning environment, the kind of sequences that are going on, what the instructor might be doing, and so on. So that's, let's say, a level up from just the students themselves talking. But you also probably want to get some indications about what's going on, say, a level down, which would be kind of the individual cognitive understandings that students might have. Again, we have techniques for how we can be collecting data and at these different levels, and then how you would kind of stitch those together as you're trying to make sense of a particular kind of intervention you might be doing, if it's an intervention study or if you're trying to understand. But that's just me. Hey, I hatched this with Madhu Kapoor and Peter Reimann. Do you think that there's some things that are missing that you don't think, that there's settings in which you could be seeing, trying to understand certain learning activities or designing certain kind of learning practices, and a complexity framework doesn't seem sufficient?
No, necessarily. Referring to one of your earlier articles where you said the framework wasn't exhaustive with regards to the complexity system conceptual perspectives. And that you only listed 8, but you could add more depending on the context of your research. Yeah,
well, we always hedge in the academic world. Well, you never want to claim that you've got it all figured out. There are a lot of complexity ideas that are kind of written about and are talked about and stuff. What we tried to do in the educational psychologist paper was to kind of pull the ones we thought would be most relevant for education. So, but we also have been kind of articulating. It was an interesting thing. At one point, an earlier version of that paper, we were calling it a meta-theory of learning as opposed to a conceptual framework. And then our reviewers kind of were giving us a hard time about the meta-theory, a perspective that would say theories should meet certain kinds of conditions in order to be complete theories, and we are proposing what those kinds of conditions would be. And so we wound up changing the title, but if you notice on the headings on the top of each page of the paper, it says a meta-theory of learning. And so we still kind of have that in mind, that it might be. But that difference between a framework that's got certain conceptual perspectives that could be relevant, and there we were trying to apply it to, say, cognitive theorizing about learning, and arguing that cognitive theories are incomplete in certain ways, failure to account for emergent properties, for example, or to discuss kind of interactions across levels, and the same with the situated perspectives. Again, the failure to account for emergent properties from, say, cognitive kinds of levels. So it's still kind of a work in progress. Maybe we'll hatch a meta-theory sometime. What do you think, Peter? Meta-theory, okay. Actually, Peter wrote all the sections of the paper about the meta-theory that we then had to sadly take out. It was, it's really hard to take out really good stuff, but we kind of got, told we had to do cutting, so.
Anybody else?
Okay. So for Michael, how can you design what field pedagogies and learning analytics to facilitate and assess knowledge transfer? Because you didn't get to explain the levels of knowledge and learning a while ago. So if you can elaborate on that. And then for Peter, what are the current practices and possibilities of using AR and VR and immersive learning environments and collecting student data? And how can you design those data structures to align with learning outcomes and feedback to teachers?
Now, that was a short question. now let me just understand the first part about the learning analytics. I couldn't quite hear you clearly.
For you,
Yeah.
what are the suggestions that you have for designing OFPL pedagogies and learning analytics to facilitate knowledge transfer? Because you have
Okay.
reading and then applying those levels of learning that you mentioned, but you didn't get to elaborate.
Yeah, well, in the reflection paper, I actually do kind of I don't focus on the transfer in the example I have, but I suggest that you can find patterns. I was using the example of badges. You know, there's a lot of interest in getting badges if you do stuff. I mean, I get little badges on my, you know, if I stand enough times on my, you know, my Apple Watch. So you could kind of design a simple study using learning analytics where you might say, if a certain group of students get badges, you know, do they do more? Do they do better on your multiple choice test? Say, you know, but that. You know, that's not a theoretically informed kind of a study. It's just saying, well, we'll give them badges and we'll see what happens. So a theoretical learning analytics study could give you some information. So in the example I propose that if you would say, use your theorizing, incorporating aspects of the complexity framework, such as sensitivity to initial conditions, that you have different groups, say, that might be getting badges, another group doesn't get a badge. But you might see that initially there's a small change that might be happening in the badge group. But since a lot of these systems are collaborative, if a few folks are doing badges and it's kind of helping them out and motivating them, and then they might be telling some of their friends, whether they face-to-face friends or online, hey, you know, doing stuff to get the badge is really, really nice. You might, you know, you could then start to get an amplification effect that would be going on. So if you theorize it, expecting that you might be seeing some nonlinearities in terms of how the uptake might occur with badges versus, say, a group that didn't do badges, then you could then be designing your assessments in ways to be looking for maybe initially minor kinds of changes, and then maybe that you would figure that you needed a certain amount of time. So I wasn't applying, in the initial thinking, wasn't really applying things towards the transfer. I do think that continues to be an issue for folks that are saying, you know, deploying higher education and replacing universities using MOOCs. You know, I think they got a lot of research to demonstrate that, first of all, you would get the learning at the level, but I still kind of feel that we at universities have a lot of work to show that the kind of learning that goes on even at a university like the University of Sydney actually helps students in ways that they can transfer and apply their knowledge outside of the formal learning settings that they have at the university. So it's not just a distance learning problem, I think it's a higher education problem, and not just at Sydney.
Was there a question for me?
Peter's feeling lonely, ask him. And my mouth is getting dry. So.
Yeah. So what are the current practices or possibilities of using AR, VR, and immersive environments in collecting student data? And then how will you align those data structures with learning outcomes and feedback for teachers?
If you don't mind, could you repeat louder?
The part the way I understand it is what you're asking, how AR, VR technologies can be used to track learner data. Yeah, okay. You picked up on that one point on the second to last slide. Is that recency? I'm looking at AR, VR, and in combination of AI, not only as a way of gathering data, but obviously that is, of course, a main advantage. If the AI system that tries to diagnose my knowledge state or skill state in particular is also able to sort of trace my hand movements and my eye gaze and my orientation towards objects of learning in the room, right? The main effect would be a benefit that, we can provide learning opportunities for students and feedback on them that go beyond what they can do just symbolically through questions and answers or problems that fit on a screen or on a piece of paper. So I think the main, I don't have many ideas about practical applications other than that is definitely possible now. When learning analytics, people are using increasingly data about that come from these kind of systems to track eye gaze. I think theoretically it's an interesting avenue because we can start working more with a relation between perception and cognition, which is perhaps much stronger than we typically acknowledge. Right, and so, for instance, finding out that experts, when they solve a problem, like a doctor on the patient, takes a certain perspective on the patient, literally by way of how close he or she is, what angle of view he or she takes. That is terribly hard to measure and to gather and to analyze, but it's also very hard to provide feedback onto medical students whom you want to sort of train in these kind of things. So that's probably the main area where I see the synergy between AI technologies we have it now and display technologies and interaction technologies, rather, I should say that, such as virtual reality, to play out, right? It will become sort of use this old principle that education also means educating the senses, not only the brain, the memory system, perhaps much more, right, than we can currently.
Yeah, could I answer a little bit on that?
You know much more about XR than I do.
I actually have a pending proposal to the Australian Research Council Discovery Program where we would be kind of integrating intelligent systems, AI, in with virtual reality systems intended for medical and health education. And the kind of angle that we're using is, because we're also committed to using a learning design of productive failure, which those of you who've taken any of my classes would have heard of, and if you probably haven't taken one of my classes, you probably never heard of it. But it's the notion that being involved with some kind of activity initially, where you're kind of giving it a go, coming up with ideas, and then receiving delayed instruction can actually set up conditions for deeper learning outcomes than having instruction provided initially. So that's a really crude, too crude of an introduction. But since we have a certain amount of empirical data about that in learning in science areas, what we're proposing in this study is to look at the development of clinical reasoning skills in both students that are in the medical program, going on to become MDs, as well as students that are in health areas such as nursing and pharmacy. But since we expect that the students would initially not be getting things solved correctly, we would be collecting information to inform the learner model that we have. Recall that Peter was talking about intelligent systems. You would have a learner model as well as a pedagogical model. Well, in our case, we have a pedagogical model of productive failure, where we expect lesser optimal initial performances, delayed instruction would occur, and then we would have them again enter into the virtual environment where they would be engaged in an activity. And then we would be expecting that they'd be doing that medical or health clinical reasoning-oriented kind of activity at a higher level. So we're interested in kind of combining both the feeding information into a learner model from a productive failure perspective, but this also is a collaboration with Judy Kay here at the University of Sydney in computer science, who's interested in open learner models, where you make available to the students what the AI system's learner model is. And so we want to be exploring whether having students getting access to the learner model that the system is developing might be helpful in certain ways as they're using the virtual system for these kinds of learning activities related to clinical reasoning. We'll see. We've got to get the grant funded before we can actually do anything. So I don't know how it'll turn out.
Dom, I might grab the mic so that we can record Dom's question as well. Sorry. There we go. Get my exercise.
Thanks. So this is a question for Michael, in fact for Peter as well. Within the context of higher education and the growing trends of online micro-credentials and unbundled courses that we're beginning to see, unbundled degree courses, the curriculum landscape is becoming more complex. Do you see any way that we could maintain the standard of education that we see in our universities, considering you've got that disparate selection of modules that people choose? Maybe they're online modules or modules from different universities, for example.
Well, it kind of begs the question just what our current level of quality is now. I mean, I think we actually don't. That we don't do a particularly good job for preparing students to use their knowledge and skills outside of the formal education settings in which they're initially learning. Here at Sydney, students get great grades, but it's kind of one of these cliches that gets written up every now and then. It takes 2 or 3 years for even the graduates from top students, whether it's here in Australia or Harvard or other top universities, before students can do, those graduated students can do productive work at, say, in organizations and companies and that type of thing. So the issue of whether we're actually having people learn for transfer now suggests that we're failing our students in certain ways with the current approaches. Now some of the kinds of areas that you're talking about, at least to me, seem to be referring to areas that probably relate more to what in the past we used to call continuing education. Ongoing, professional education is another, important area. So, lifelong learning and those kinds of things are very real. Some of the slide that Peter put up about the kind of changes are going to be going on. Many jobs are going to be going away. Many kinds of career areas are going to be going away. The need for people to retool. It's a huge area and issue that we have. And so, I think in a way we might be better served to be thinking about how do we apply learning sciences insights about how it is that people learn, and then do it rather than say what we're doing now is great at universities, how do we maintain it as we offer new courses? Let's be thinking about what does the research tell us about how students can be better learning, whether it's enabled with technology or in face-to-face settings, and then be designing the kinds of experiences based on that research. And we might find that we would be doing things perhaps differently for some of these professional education and kind of sometimes retooling kinds of approaches. And we might find we might be thinking about some ways that we're redoing formal education as well. I don't know, Peter, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think there are at least 2 ways to think about that. So one is really more data-driven, and that's already happening, right? So part of learner analytics looks at, paths, course decisions that students make, or in professional learning, it can be smaller units, what they look at lynda.com and in what sequence. And to the extent that there's an external criterion available, such as satisfaction, often done in professional learning, or marks or grades, more done in school and university settings, one can obviously use machine learning to sort of have guesses what are, in this myriads of potential paths, what are good ones, or at least what are not so good ones, right? And that's certainly happening and will continue to happen, as to some extent useful, because it's pragmatically doable and yield some information. They're interesting. I mean, a lot of, particularly in Europe, the use of modern technology and AI included for education was actually around that scenario. So people having choices online and how would we help them? How could we help them through using, for instance, AI technologies to make smart decisions about what to do next and so forth when they find themselves on a learning path, which has a high branching factor. One of the more promising approaches, at least as far as I can tell, comes from the area of dynamic assessment. So we had a structurally similar problem in assessment, or have. Basically, which question should we ask students, given that we know their answer already? It's not a good idea to ask every student the same kind of questions, because some answers are more informative than others, right? And some answers tell me that I don't have to ask the other questions, because to come to that answer, these things need already be known, and I don't have to ask explicitly for them. So that's basically the logic of dynamic testing. Out of that came, which is a subsection of psychometrics, and out of that area came actually quite some nice applications for learning in general. So there are, and I mentioned it on one of my slides, you didn't pick up on that, was that knowledge space theory. So that was, why not that? Much better story. And I could go on and on. But knowledge space theory is one of the, if you Google it, has been applied, for instance, to game-based learning, to professional learning as well, to micro-teaching, and exactly in answer to that question, how can we allow a defragmentation of this kind of highly compartmentalized mini-learning scenarios? How can we provide not only feedback to a student how he or she is doing, but also feed forward, what to do next, right? What would be a good challenge for you to address next, given that you're at this level now? And so there are answers to that, how to do that computationally, quite interesting ones, and I think a good few of them have not been widely tried.
So,
speaking of the future.
Thank you. So I'd like to open it up to anybody else in the wider audience that has a question for either Michael or Peter or both.
Thank you for a couple of great talks today. I found that it was quite pessimistic about machine learning and how dumb it is, and that it doesn't have a brain of its own. And I was wondering, what's the role of learning sciences to perhaps direct machine learning to give us that sort of actionable knowledge? If it's very good at looking at thousands and thousands of examples, and with all of the huge increase of inputs of what people are doing, what they're looking at, where they're sitting, how they're doing it, do you see a future where, if you combine that idea of how humans learn with that all-seeing eye and looking at lots of data, would you get something from it that's telling you generally how people work, and then personally how you best work and how you best learn? So learning analytics seem to be, for lots of people, it's not so much about me, the individual, and what I'm doing. So I don't know if that's a question, but where do you think that's
I start, and I think Michael has its own thoughts on this. I'm not pessimistic in general. I'm quite in awe about the classification power and the pattern recognition power. But obviously that's one component that could be quite useful. And as I mentioned, sort of immediately useful can be in scoring complex artifacts, right? So, for instance, now at Sydney, I work with colleagues in medicine who ask their students, each student out of 600 in semester 1 to produce a short 3-minute video on X. Now, how do you score, grade, mark, and give feedback on that? I mean, you just do 3 minutes sounds short, but if it's 600 times 3 minutes, on an open artifact that's not genre-wise much constrained, you'll find yourself a really interesting cast. Now, one could use quite directly machine learning algorithms, particularly neural nets, to, for instance, look for certain features in that video that the assignment said should be met, right? So I want to see 2 patients in the video, right? And some videos will have none, we know that as students, and others will have 10, right? And I could train a machine learning algorithm in an afternoon to identify, in video, even I am not machine learning, to solve that task. I make it 2 days, not an afternoon. So I think that's eminently important, because scoring is really hard in assessment, particularly scoring of multimedia products, which we really encourage students to build and develop and create and so forth. But I think if you really want to go full circle and sort of integrate that into a really system that then can, really work with students, also giving the feedback and communicating it and so forth, you're confronted with a much bigger problem. I don't want to talk to you, I want to just point you to an example where that's really well done. So if you look at IBM, what's it called, Decision Maker or something similar. That's online, it's a service. And what it does is it listens into meetings or conversations and it plays devil's advocate, right? So it takes voice, and for instance, if it's a business meeting and they talk about, strategy, where to build the next plant, the decision maker goes out and finds counter arguments, because it knows managers are subject to groupthink, right? But if you now look behind, there are fantastic videos online about IBM, and all the research papers behind, there's about 300 are publicly available. You will realize there is much more in this than just the machine learning bit, right? And that's basically my argument. You have to have a system of that quality as service. You have to go, natural language processing, finding contrary patterns, which is a bit of machine learning, tailoring the communication back to your client, as it were. That's all not within the narrow margins of machine learning. So I guess I'm not pessimistic in general. I'm just pessimistic for the message, this is all you need to do is deep learning, throw it to everything, the world will be fine.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with those points, and it's a good example. I'm not pessimistic. I just think that some people have tried to misuse the term learning. Pattern finding is pattern finding. The reason that we gave the definition of learning that we did in Educational Psychologist was to suggest that learning is much more. It emerges out of interactions. In our brains, the kind of connections that we have, the formation, the kind of schema, they even use a term schema abstraction, that it's not that you plug something into your brain, but out of the interactions that you have, and some of these are mediated by, the embodied cognition perspectives that we have and so on, that we then kind of emerge in terms of the understanding. So I wish we didn't call it machine learning, call it machine pattern finding. I'd be just swell with that. And that the other thing, though, the patterns that you typically can find do need to have typically a certain degree of scope in terms of regularity. So as long as it's somewhat well structured, the area that you want, these kinds of techniques can have some value. So if there's a whole bunch of stuff and there's a certain amount of regularity, these kinds of pattern finding algorithms can be enormously helpful to human beings. But the human being is going to be providing the meaning of that. Why would that be useful? Why wouldn't it be useful? Just because you find a pattern doesn't mean it's a useful pattern. Some human being's going to need to be able to make that determination.
Does it work better with language, since that's a certain pattern and has certain meaning in that? So with learning through what people are saying or what they're writing.
Well, again, as long as you might have a situation that's relatively scripted. I think it was Google that had an example of where they had a system call up a hair, to make an appointment at the hair salon, I think. Was that the example? And it did a pretty good job of calling up a real human, and then, the voice, generation and stuff. But you see, that's a pretty scripted kind of situation. You see, and so you can be designing these kinds of systems to handle certain degrees of, you have a few degrees of freedom that it can work and be pretty good. So as long as what you need is to have it call up and talk to the, make the appointment, and things like that could save a person a bit of time. That's fine. I would use a system like that. But don't overclaim that somehow it's capable of doing, kind of novel, creative kinds of things. The thinking of these as cognitive tools as opposed to, these artificial intelligence systems. Somebody has to program the AI. The AI might be able to do some little kind of stuff, but essentially anything that gets programmed was programmed by a team, and then it does certain kinds of things. And if those things are useful, that's wonderful. Just like it's really great that our car might go faster than we can walk. That's fine. It doesn't mean that I no longer need to walk. It's a tool, and I want to be able to use that tool. So we don't. I would like us to not be in awe of these kinds of things, that we understand the limitations and the advantages, and then as designers, learning designers, be taking advantage of those things with knowledge of what limitations might exist.
Thank you, Mike. We have time for one more question, if anyone has. All right. Great.
Thanks. I work at the university. I won't tell you where, but it just reminded me of something I saw where one of our colleagues was asking if we could incorporate a chatbot into our online learning materials, not just to help with ordinary questions like, when is this assessment going to be, but to actually provide more pedagogical sort of guidance. And there is something here, Jill Watson, Georgia Tech's first AI teaching assistant. How good is Jill?
How good is what?
Jill Watson.
I haven't used that system. Have you?
No, but
Could you repeat the question? Found it becomes online people.
yeah, I think I didn't get the Jill Watson thing. Is that a chatbot, a particular chatbot?
Knowledge-based artificial intelligence, AI teaching assistant based on IBM's Watson.
IBM's Watson, yeah. So, okay, so her first name is Jill. The I think chatbots are interesting but I wouldn't probably use them more for my students to program them rather than program them myself to answer questions to my students. I think currently how chatbots are built, they are not particularly intelligent. Also, they are quite amazing in what they do. The underlying approach is fairly straightforward. And I think there would be an ideal tool to sort of involve students in programming a chatbot to sort of answer questions about medicine or physics or whatever their learning area is. We know we learn a lot by explaining to another person something, and there's also research, a bit niche still, but I think that will grow as we go. That also is a great value in teaching a computer what to do or to answer, and not the teacher or the expert, but letting the student do that. So because then they have to externalize and be quite detailed about what they think goes into a specific answer or skill, right? And I think in that area I would see the most, currently at least, the most productive use of chatbots. In addition to, you mentioned the routine thing, 80% of questions to a teacher are fairly routine, and you sort of, the other kind of questions you say, well, it says in the syllabus, but then you don't dare to say that, and so you'll answer it again. Obviously, bots can be trained to answer these routine questions, and not so routine, but that's but limited. As Michael said, they're very script oriented. They work in one section and then not. And to our knowledge, of course, whenever students have the idea that they can beat something, they will start, exploring the boundaries of this, which might also be interesting. So I think it's a fascinating technology, but maybe not so much as a teaching tool, but more really as a way for students to use. Also outsmart and things. I know they will do that anyway.
Yeah. No, I think those are good points. The principle that's going on there, though, is that it's one of the things that you really had in the earlier research on intelligent tutoring systems. They found that they were capable of working in domains that I would call relatively well structured. So if you look at, say, the cognitive tutors at Carnegie Mellon, brilliant stuff, but they were in algebra. They're in beginning programming languages. Areas for which there is a right answer and a wrong answer. You could have a procedural way to do something, or declarative knowledge, factual information. When you get into areas for which there might be multiple ways that you could solve a problem, areas that are more conceptually ill-structured, this is where the systems are brittle. So they are designed, the kinds of ways that you program these AI formalisms, the kind of decision tree structures, production rule things that Peter was talking a little bit about, they work fine if you have conceptual regularity. And then it can go through a lot of those rules quickly because we got fast computers now. But once you start to have things for which experts, for example, would have multiple ways of solving, the systems aren't going to be able to do that. And this notion that I was talking about earlier of being able to transfer, that we want to have students be able to learn in ways they can transfer or apply their knowledge to solve new problems, they sure would like to be able to do that in AI as well. But that's pretty much outside of what anybody's demonstrated that I'm familiar with. So is it interesting? And again, research like Dan Schwartz's group has done, where you have students teaching teachable agents, I think they call that work. But what they were teaching were things like subtraction or addition. Did they learn some things probably useful about addition and subtraction, in mathematics, perhaps. Learn some things about coding, probably, but they weren't teaching things about quantum physics and advanced macroeconomics or something like that.
Thank you, Michael. Mm-hmm. Well, please join me in thanking Peter and Michael. So to let everyone know, this is a 5-seminar series. This was the first, looking at the future of learning innovation from a learning sciences perspective. And same place, same time next week, we're going to take a business and organizational management perspective.